Hey everyone, welcome back. And today, what we're going to do is we're going to be continuing our exploration of electromagnetic induction. And we'll be talking specifically about what are called Lenz's law and Faraday's law. And I just have to say right at the outset that this is one of my favorite topics to teach about, specifically Faraday's law. And the reason for that is because, well, I have this wonderful big cat, and his name is Faraday. And when I say he's big, I really mean he's big. Here, let me show you a photo I took with my phone the other day. Sorry for the glare, but of course you can see this is me, and that is him. He's a purebred Maine Coon, and he really is as big as he looks. And so that is why Faraday's law is one of my favorite laws of physics to teach about, right? Because of my cat Faraday. Anyway, that said, let's just go through a quick summary of what we saw last time when we were looking at the basics of electromagnetic induction. Now, what we did there is we talked about the idea of the falling metal bar through the magnetic field. And when we used our right hand and our left hand rules that we learned earlier when we were discussing magnetism, you could see that the bar will polarize electrically under those conditions. And if you have the bar connected to an external complete circuit, then you can get an induced current flowing around that circuit, and there we go, voila, electromagnetic induction, right? Using magnetism to create an electrical current. Now, what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be looking at some things a little bit deeper, though, right? Because when we looked at the idea of the falling metal bar, and you get the induced current according to the right or the left-hand rule, depending upon if you're talking about electron flow or conventional current, one of the things that we noticed is that you got a secondary effect, and the secondary effect was magnetic braking, because the induced current that flows through the bar interacts with and sorry, my video seemed to hang up for a second. So the induced current interacts with the magnetic field which created it in the first place. And that interaction leads to a braking force, okay? And it's called a braking force because that force acted in the opposite direction, in the case of the example we saw last time, upwards, of the velocity downwards, right? So forces that act in the opposite direction when something's moving slow these things down, hence braking. And hopefully you looked at the videos that I also included last time, and you saw a lot of examples of that. I hope you enjoyed the video of me and my physics geek colleagues. We were playing around with the large neodymium magnet and the copper disk and the liquid nitrogen and so on. If you haven't watched that video, go back and watch it from last time. It is really pretty wild. And so, there you go. Now, at the very end, I asked you to watch one more very brief video. And this is the idea of the jumping ring. And the problem with the jumping ring is it seems to be completely at odds with everything else that we observed in terms of magnetic braking, right? How can, on the one hand, you get this force of interaction which opposes the motion of something, right? The falling bar or the moving magnet against the copper plate and so on. How can you have that on one hand, but then on the other hand, you have this ring that just pops up? That's the creation of motion. That's the opposite of braking, right? So something seems not to fit here. Well, what's going on has to do with deeper concepts that I alluded to last time, and now we're going to really start digging into them. And so the real key here, in order to understand what's going on, is you have to know more about something called magnetic flux. Okay, so let's write that down, and then what we'll do is we'll start to explore this idea of magnetic flux. Magnetic flux is the key here, okay? And we got to be careful because there's a lot of F words floating around, right? We have force, we have magnetic forces, we have magnetic fields. Well, now we have another one, magnetic flux, right? You have to make sure you don't confuse these three things. Remember, forces are pushes, and the right hand rule or the left hand rule, that's your palm. The magnetic field, right, is created by currents flowing through wire or moving charge, right? And in terms of the right and the left hand rule, those are your fingers. Magnetic flux is something very different, okay? And this is the key idea to understanding electromagnetic induction and all of these things that you're observing, okay? So in order for you to understand the idea of magnetic flux, we're going to use kind of a silly little exercise here, mental exercise, to help you understand it. So what I want you to do is I want you to imagine that we're talking about our favorite Looney Tunes character, Bugs Bunny, and a popular show from recent years, Game of Thrones, right? So let's imagine Bugs Bunny. He's his wisecracking self, and let's suppose he's hanging out in some tavern in King's Landing, okay? And because Bugs Bunny is who he is, right? He's poking fun at people and he's cracking jokes and stuff. And let's suppose what he does is he makes a joke about some other people who are in the tavern, and these other people are Lannister guards, right? Now these guys they don't have any sense of humor, right? So they completely take the joke the wrong way, and they get mad, and so they come after Bugs Bunny, right? They grab their spears off the wall and they just start coming after him, and they want to stab him, they want to kill him. So Bugs Bunny doesn't want to get killed, right? So what does he do? He runs, and a merry chase ensues through the streets and the alleyways of King's Landing. Okay, so let's suppose that what happens is he's running down this alley and he's trying to get away from all these guards that are chasing him. And so he slips through an open doorway. And then what he does is as soon as he gets through the open door, he slams the door shut behind him in an attempt to give them the slip, right? Hopefully, they didn't see him duck into this door. And so what he does is, let's suppose he runs through the doorway. He closes the door behind him. He's leaning up against the door like this. Right. So in our analogy, kind of imagine that the cover of the book here, like this is the doorway, right? So he slams the door shut. He's sitting here and he's against the door. And then, of course, in true cartoon fashion, the guards weren't fooled, and so they're on the other side of the door, and they shove their spears through the door. Right now, this is a family show, right? So Bugs Bunny doesn't actually get stabbed or killed, and the spear tips end up forming this sort of Bugs Bunny outline around him, and he goes, yikes, and he runs off. And now you have this visual aid, I hope, of all of these spear tips poking through this door, okay? Now, if you can understand that idea of these spear tips poking through the door, then you've got the idea of magnetic flux down. Because I want you to think about the spear tips as magnetic field lines, okay? And this door has a certain area associated with it. And when you have magnetic field lines poke through an area, that is when you get flux. Magnetic flux is the combination of the number or the intensity of these magnetic field lines multiplied by the area through which they penetrate, right? So if you had more spears, you would have more flux. If you had a bigger area so that more spears would be able to poke through, you would also have a bigger flux. So let's write that down. Okay. The symbol for magnetic flux, it's a goofy looking symbol. It's called a Greek letter phi. Looks like this. That means magnetic flux. And this is equal to magnetic field. Remember, the symbol for magnetic field is capital B times the area. Okay, so in our analogy, this would be like the number of spear tips that poke through the door. This would be the area of the door. But there's something else going on here, which ends up being really important. So we gotta look at something else with our little story. Okay. So let's suppose that what we do is we rewind the story, right? And we go back to the beginning, right, where the chase begins. And let's suppose that Bugs Bunny, he runs down the alley, he sees the open door, he goes through the door, but he doesn't quite have enough time to get the door shut completely before the Lannister guards shove their spears through the door. Okay? So let's suppose, instead of shutting the door completely and then having the spear tips poke through the door like this, let's suppose he only gets the door shut partway, like maybe at a 45 degree something like this. Instead of all the way shut, maybe a 45 degree. Now, if that's the case, here come the spear tips. Boom, spear tips come through. Can you see that some of the spear tips are going to go through the door, but not all of them? Some of them will also come through this little gap right here without penetrating the door itself. So what's happened in that case is that you have less flux through the door. Not the doorway, but through the door itself. Okay? And if Bugs is moving really slow, that is, the guards are right on his tail, so let's suppose he doesn't have any time to mess with closing the door at all, right? So he just leaves the door completely open like this. He runs through, and then here come the spear tips. Do any of those spear tips go through the door? No, because they're going parallel to the door, right? So in that case, the flux through the door is 0. There's no flux through the door. So there's an angular dependence here, right? So what we have to do is we have to note that you get maximum flux when the door is perpendicular to the spears, that is, the area is perpendicular to the field lines, and you get minimum, that is 0 flux, when you have the door parallel to the spears or the area parallel to the magnetic field lines. So what we're going to do is we're going to adjust our relationship over here slightly, and we're going to note that we're going to put a little perpendicular symbol on the area here, like that. It's perpendicular. And we have to note that this is the area perpendicular to the magnetic field. Okay. So this is the idea of magnetic flux, right? Okay, so what? Why? Why do we care about magnetic flux? Well, it ends up that magnetic flux is absolutely critical to understanding the real details of what's going on with electromagnetic induction. Let's go back to our analogy again, right? Let's suppose that what you've got is you've got the guards, the Lenz guards, they shove their spears through this doorway, or through the door, not the doorway, the door itself, right? So you've got these spears that are poking out through the door, right? They've kind of pierced the wood of the door. Now, if you're one of the guards on the other side of the door, right? So let me turn it this way, right? So you got your spear tips going this way, and you're behind the door, and you got your hands on the spear tip, right? If you try to push the spears further into the door, wouldn't you encounter some opposition to that, right? Or if you tried to pull the spears out like this, would you encounter some opposition? Yeah, it wouldn't be easy to push or pull it out. Also, if the door, when the spear tips are stuck through there, started to open or close like this, wouldn't you feel that opposition, right, as this tried to move, right? Okay, and that's the key idea, right? The key idea is that when you have magnetic flux, right, that is, if you have magnetic field lines that are poking through an area, and to be specific here, what I'm really getting at is I'm getting at the idea of you have magnetic field lines poking through like a loop of wire, right? So here I have a metallic loop, right? So you have this loop of wire, or you can imagine you have a bunch of these loops, a bunch of coils, and you have magnetic field lines poking through here. If you try to change anything, there's an opposition to that change, okay? And this is a really important idea. This is what gets into what's called Lenz's law. Lenz's law talks about magnetic flux in terms of, I like to think of it as a kind of electromagnetic inertia. Right? Now recall, the idea of inertia is an object is in its certain state of motion. It could be at rest or it could be moving at a constant velocity. It doesn't like to change that state of motion. It's difficult to change that state of motion because of inertia. There is sort of an electromagnetic variation having to do with this situation. If you have a coil of wire and you have magnetic field lines poking through there, if you try to change anything, right? If you try to increase the magnetic field lines this way, or if you try to decrease them, that's kind of like trying to shove the spear tips further through the door or pull them out. If you try to do either of those things, you will encounter an opposition to that. Or if you try to twist this, right? If you try to twist the coil relative to the magnetic field lines, or you could try twisting the magnetic field lines relative to the coil like that. You could do either one. That would be analogous to, you've got the spears penetrating through the door, and you try to open or close the door like this, or if you try to twist the spear tips back and forth like that, you would also encounter opposition to that. You would feel that, okay? And that is that idea of electromagnetic inertia. Once you have the magnetic flux set up in one of these systems, it doesn't want to change. And so if you try to change the magnetic flux in a coil, through a coil of wire, for example, then that opposition is manifested in an induced voltage. Okay, now I'm using the word voltage now. You see, last time we talked about current. I'm using the word voltage because you may recall from an earlier unit that in order to get a current, you have to have a voltage that pushes the current. Okay, and so what we're really getting to today is the idea of the induced voltage, right? And so what happens is you get this induced voltage, and the induced voltage is a result of opposing this attempted change in the magnetic flux. Okay, in one of the videos that you'll watch after this one, I like the way that they put it. They say you don't get something for nothing, right? It's like the induced voltage and the induced current doesn't just pop out of nowhere. It comes from something, right? And what it's coming from is this opposition to change, okay? And so when you try to change the magnetic flux in whatever way, you can try changing the magnetic field strength, you can try changing the area, you can try changing the angle, twisting things around, then you get this, by Lenz's law, you get this opposition to that change due to this kind of electromagnetic inertia, and that it results in an induced voltage, which will push a current if you have a closed loop for the current to follow around, so a closed circuit. And if we want to be able to quantify this idea, which we do, I'm going to try not to get too mathematical here, but it's important for something you'll see later when we talk about transformer coils. That's what Faraday's law allows us to do, right? Lenz's law gives us the idea that the induced voltage is in opposition to the attempted change of magnetic flux. Faraday's law allows us to calculate the amount of the induced voltage. How much is it? Okay, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to write down the equation for Faraday's law, and then I'm going to point out a couple of things to you to help you understand exactly what it means. Okay, so okay, so here's what Faraday's law says. Faraday's law says that the induced voltage, and I'm going to use just a delta V here, right, for voltage, okay, is equal to this quantity. Okay, now the induced voltage here, that is going to be equal to this expression here. Now let me point out this minus sign, the minus sign, that's Lenz's law. That minus sign just means that's the whole thing about the system opposing any change in magnetic flux, right? It's the opposite. It's you can almost think of it as an electrical equivalent of Newton's third law. It's sort of an action-reaction thing. That's all the minus sign means. The N here, we'll get to that in a moment. Okay. Now here, what you see, this last term, this that I put in parentheses right now, this is the change in magnetic flux, right? That's the idea we talked about before, that the magnetic flux has to change, right? And remember, there's three ways to change the magnetic flux. You could change the strength of the magnetic field. You could change the area of the loop, or you can twist it, kind of like we talked about opening and closing the door. Any of those things, any of those changes will induce a voltage. Now, what's with the delta T here? Well, the delta T references something that you saw in one of the earlier videos from last time. If you recall from last time, you may have noticed in one of those videos that how quickly you move the magnet towards and away from the coil of wire made a difference. If you move the magnet slowly, you wouldn't induce much voltage and you wouldn't get much current. But if you move the magnet quickly, then you get a huge amount of induced voltage and induced current, right? So it's not just the fact that you have to change the magnetic flux to get these effects. It's the rate at which you change the magnetic flux, okay? So the more quickly that you change the magnetic flux, the more quickly you move the magnet back and forth, or the more quickly you twist the coil back and forth, the greater the rate of change of magnetic flux and the greater your induced voltage is going to be. Right? So let's make a note of this. What this whole thing right here means is this is the rate of flux change. Now, last but not least, what is this N all about? What's going on there? Well, what the N stands for is the number of loops, okay? The number of loops in your coil of wire, for example. Okay, so if you think about it, this kind of makes sense, okay? If you have just one loop of wire, like this single loop I've got right here, then you've got a certain amount of magnetic flux due to these magnetic field lines poking through there, right? Okay, but let's suppose you have multiple loops, right? You just kind of keep looping and looping and looping and looping, and you have all of these loops, you know, like 10, 20, 50 of these things or whatever. Each loop contributes to an area, right, for the magnetic flux. So every single one of these loops has its own area, and if you increase the number of loops, you're effectively increasing the area, and that is effectively increasing the amount of flux there. And so then if you try to change this, right, that's where that N comes in. And you're going to see next time when we start talking about a really interesting application of Faraday's law, that is transformer coils, this N right here, this number of loops, is going to be absolutely critical into understanding how transformer coils work and how that is very practical for our power transmission system that we use. Okay, so let me make a couple of quick closing remarks here. The important thing to understand, even though these are kind of tricky ideas, is they're very, very fundamental. They're very important, right? There's a lot of applications for them. I mentioned one just a few moments ago, the idea of transformer coils and power transmission. We'll get into that more next time. I had some questions from some people in the discussion board links about this. One person was asking me, is this what induction cooking on a stovetop is all about? That's exactly right. This is exactly how induction cooking works. It's the same process. You can, somebody else was asking me about, what about radio? Yes, this is exactly how radio works. Radio, Wi-Fi, cell phone technology, all of it is based upon this stuff. It's based upon Faraday's law. Okay, so if you can understand the concepts behind Faraday's law and electromagnetic induction, you can understand all kinds of technology that's around you all the time right now. Whether it's why the lights work and how that power is distributed across the country, to how your cell phone, right? How your cell phone functions and can transmit signals and so on. Now, one last remark I'll make about the jumping ring, right? Because we haven't explained the jumping ring yet. Right? Why does the ring jump? And that seems to be completely the opposite of magnetic braking, like you saw last time. Okay. To help understand it, there's a few videos that I want you to take a look at after this one. But I do want to point out one critical thing to note about those videos. Remember that in order for all of this to happen, right, you have to have changes. Change is the key word. You have to have changes in magnetic flux. Okay? And in order for the jumping ring to work, that means the current that drives the whole system to begin with has to be an alternating current. Right? Now remember, there's a difference between alternating current and direct current. Direct current moves only one way, right? Direct current moves only one way around the circuit. It just kind of keeps on going. It doesn't change. But alternating current zips back and forth around the circuit. And because it's constantly zipping back and forth, that, by definition, is always changing. That's one of the key things to understand behind why the jumping ring works. Okay, I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, post them in the discussion board. You guys take care, stay safe, go Team Physics.